We'll get started. As soon as I get my third board member up here, we'll get going. I assume so, but I want to get started. Yeah, if you don't mind, I can. Thank you. Jen, just 1 minute.
Thanks.
We're going to resume with Jen Eckerly from NRDC, followed by Bob Fredenberg from Assemblyman Alejo's committee. I hope you don't mind letting Jen go because she's already sitting. I was looking at you before, but I didn't have a card, so I didn't call on you. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, but Bob Fredenberg will be next. He'll jump ahead of you, Joe. Okay.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Jen Eckerly. I'm an ocean policy consultant with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I just want to start by thanking the board and staff for all of the incredible work that's been done to develop this policy today. We support the comments that you heard previously by the Coastkeeper Alliance, and I'm going to focus my comments on the policy as it relates to marine protected areas and also the out-of-kind mitigation ratio. So as you are all aware, the state's MPA network is a result of significant social and financial investment by a diverse constituency across California. And lasting success of this marine protected area network really depends on successful implementation, including an ongoing commitment by state agencies to integrate MPAs into their decision-making and policy-making. So to that end, we really appreciate the clarification in the policy that clarifies that intake structures should not be located within MPAs or state water quality protected areas unless it can be shown that there's going to be no impacts to marine life from installation, operation, and ongoing maintenance. However, we continue to have concerns about the policy as it relates to discharge impacts in MPAs and state water quality protected areas. The initial draft of the desal policy included very precautionary language that discharges be sited at a sufficient distance so there are no impacts from the discharge to protected areas. The revised policy removes this comprehensive discharge prohibition for impacts to protected area and limits the criteria only to salinity. While salinity and brine dilution levels are a top concern, impacts of chemicals used through the desalination process as well as thermal effects from brine discharge also need to be evaluated and harmful impacts to MPAs avoided. We understand that the board believes that the ocean plan's toxicity requirements are sufficient to adequately address these chemical discharges. However, given the toxicity of desal chemicals to marine life, even in low concentrations, and the potential effects of thermal differences between discharge and source waters, we believe that the desal amendment should explicitly prohibit any discharge impacts into protected areas. Given the considerable investment in MPAs and their importance in the success of the long-term health of California's oceans, we believe that embedding that prohibitive language in the policy rather than just relying on the toxicity requirements is really important. Long before the MLPA was passed, this board was taking a leadership role to safeguard protected important areas in the ocean through ASBSs. The goals of the MLPA really align closely with your charge to protect beneficial uses of the ocean, and so we encourage that alignment to continue. So really briefly, I know I'm out of time. We have concerns about the 1 to 10 credit ratio for out-of-kind mitigation. If after the fact restoration is going to be allowed, we agree that the mitigation should be the replacement of all forms of marine life. Yet instead of ensuring the mitigation minimizes mortality of all forms of marine life, the amendment provides a 1 to 10 ratio for out-of-kind mitigation, providing replacement credit that discounts APF for marine species through restoration of out-of-kind habitat lacks any connection to the loss of habitat value and the species that are to be replaced. So for an example, anchovies spend much of their time migrating in the water column, and squids spend much of their time in the benthos. However, and those species can be impacted both by intakes and discharges. However, restoration in wetlands is really not going to benefit those species. So any indirect benefits for wetland restoration really argue for a multiplier for out-of-kind mitigation rather than a 1 to 10 ratio. So does that make sense?
So you're saying more than 1 to 10?
Saying instead of 1 acre of wetland restoration replacing 10 acres of open water or soft bottom, it should really be reversed. You should get, 10 acres of replacement wetland habitat for 1 acre, or some flip inverse of that ratio.
All right, because, right, so that our proposal's thinking is because you can't replace what's there, it's giving a smaller ratio.
Yeah, and it should really be
opposed
giving
to
a larger
the-
ratio because you're not really doing in-kind replacement.
All right, so we'll need to talk about that. I want to ask staff some questions on what you said.
Thank you.
Why did you make the change on the MPA language, considering that's such a strong policy of the state and was made through enormous blood, sweat, and tears, so to speak, up and down the coast?
That is, for those of you who have it in front of you, it should be on page 5, and it's in 2B7. And the reason we changed it from no impact to, let's see, discharges shall be sited at a sufficient distance from an MPA so the salinity within the boundaries of an MPA does not exceed natural background salinity. And this was because we received a number of public comments that said, how are we supposed to meet a no impact standard, and what does that mean? And so since this amendment deals specifically with salinity and it's being inserted into the ocean plan, which deals with other issues related to discharges, this isn't in a vacuum where it's saying, the discharge from this desalination facility can have all of these other impacts, but just not salinity. It's saying that salinity is in addition to the other protections that are existing in the ocean plan. And since we have had the expert panel and we're setting the limit of a receiving water limitation of 2 above natural background salinity, this is more protective than that. So it says you can't even exceed natural background salinity in an MPA or a SWRCB. So.
Yeah, and isn't it true, Ms. Wagner, that salinity is a tracer for these discharges, it's likely to be sort of the first thing that would turn up in terms of a measurable difference relative to measuring chemicals or measuring toxicity differences. So in other words, salinity is conservative as an environmental indicator of water quality in this setting.
I think it would be a good indicator that there may not be adequate mixing. So you mentioned earlier the stratification, and so that would be something that you would immediately see, and that would have effects that were measurable.
Yeah, so I think, well, my point is that the salinity, not allowing differences in salinity should also, therefore, not allow differences in other constituents in the discharge, is really my point. So there's a safety net by using that indicator.
All right, this may be an issue we come back to, and I know the mitigation issue is a whole parcel of issues, and we will, put a little pin in that we will come back to it. But do you want to respond to the 1 to 10? I get the idea that you can't restore those particular habitats, but why 1 to 10 in that direction rather than 1 for 1 or?
So I'd like to first clarify it's a backstop. So it's not automatically 1 to 10. the way this is drafted for out-of-kind mitigation, you actually have to do an assessment of relative productivity of your habitat that you're impacting and then the proposed mitigation habitat. And so this is, the reason we did this is because this is what was done in the past for the Carlsbad Desalination Project, where Dr. Pete Ramundi, who was on our expert panel, looked at their proposed mitigation plan, and because they came to the conclusion that mitigating for open water species or some of the soft bottom species isn't practical or feasible, rather than doing no mitigation, you might as well do some mitigation that results in an overall better mitigation project. Now, in that particular instance, they did use a 1-to-10 ratio, and so that's why we propose that as the backstop, as the limit.
That's
So
a
you can't do
minimum.
1-to-20, you couldn't do 1-to-30, but you could do 1-to-5. And then in addition to that, there's a provision in here that allows for the regional boards to adjust the mitigation ratio for uncertainty associated with the mitigation project. So for those who are familiar with wetlands mitigation, it's often hard to recreate nature.
It's virtually impossible.
Right, and so it's not saying that in all cases this will be the case. We just put upper and lower bound, there's no upper on it, there's a lower boundary. And so it's up to the discretion of the regional board, and we assumed this would be something that, they're going to have to prove it up as to this is the productivity in this habitat, this is the proposed productivity here, we think this is an appropriate ratio, and then we're assuming it'll be some sort of negotiation, but with the data to show that there's full mitigation.
Because an acre is not an acre.
Right.
Right, so acres aren't actually the measure you're looking for, it's productivity, right? So this is just putting a lower bound on the acreage. But is there a standard for figuring out the productivity for alternative, out of kind?
So that's when we thought that was getting a little bit too into the weeds for the statewide policy. There are a number of different metrics that you could use to assess productivity. So biomass is a really simple one, but it doesn't capture things like ecosystem functions.
No, you could end up with, I started my career on biomass, not a substitute for,
Right. So the staff report
Balanced
includes an
population.
example that talks about biomass, but by no means is that the recommended metric. It's just saying this needs to be investigated. The last line in here says that the rationale for mitigation ratios must be documented in the administrative record, and that's something that goes through the public process, because there's two sides to this where we have, project proponents who in the past have said, we're looking at these habitats that are open water, soft bottom, they're not as productive. I'm doing something that's more productive, I should get some sort of credit for that. And then the other side where you aren't truly replacing the species that are lost. So it's something that's going to be a balancing act for the regional board.
maybe at the lunch break, I'll look at the language myself. Thank you. Again, it's just helpful to ask the questions as they come up. We'll come back to some of these issues over and over again, I'm sure. Sorry, let me move this out of the way. Mr. Fredenberg, it's up to you, followed by Rita Kampala from Heal the Bay.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members. My name is Bob Fredenberg. I'm one of the staff to Assemblyman Alejo, and he just asked for me to stop by. He did submit sort of a late comment letter when we saw the most current set of modifications to the plan. But primarily, he simply asked that I come by and thank the board for the work you're doing. He's enthusiastic about broad statewide policy on desal plants. This directly affects the district that he represents throughout Monterey and the Central Coast. So it's of critical importance, and having a statewide standard that provides some assurance is really critical. We would like to associate ourselves with the comments from the city of Salinas. We've got some unique situations with the water quality and availability in the inland portion of Monterey County, and these new projects have the potential for providing a huge relief for the communities around in the Salinas Valley. So that's critical, and we appreciate the mayor being here and supporting the work that's being done. I will say that the one element of the proposal that there's concern about is simply the decision on intake requirements and subsurface intakes versus alternatives. And the concern is simply that we look at projects case by case and that we not discourage projects that have a huge benefit. Predetermined decision about the engineering of a project. But that would be the only concern that we would bring to this discussion. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. After Ms. Kamplath, we have Joe Geaver from Surfrider.
Chair Marcus and State Water Board members, my name is Rita Kamplath. I'm the Director of Science and Policy at Heal the Bay. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to present our comments on the proposed amendment. We'd also like to thank the board staff for their hard work on this issue. With the many demands for California's water and a changing climate, some communities are looking to desalination as a potential solution. Given the high costs and environmental impacts, we believe that it should be an option of last resort in terms of drought response, used only after more cost-effective and sustainable solutions have been implemented to the fullest extent possible, including conservation measures, stormwater capture and reuse, and water recycling. If desalination is pursued, it is critical that strong statewide standards are in place to ensure that the facilities are designed to minimize impacts on our precious marine resources, particularly those resulting from brine discharges and the use of harmful surface intakes. While we appreciate the staff's hard work on the proposed amendment, we have several concerns about it. First, it allows too much flexibility in determining infeasibility of subsurface intakes. These should be considered the first line option, with design criteria and site selection processes defined to encourage their use. The relatively simple edits, which were proposed by California Coastkeeper, would address these concerns. And I'd like to reiterate that intake screens are simply not an acceptable mitigation measure for surface intakes, because all they do is shift impingement and entrainment effects to smaller organisms. As the staff report states, there's only an approximate 1% reduction in entrainment mortality between screened and unscreened intakes. We also would strongly recommend that a study be conducted to identify sites on the California coast that could support subsurface intakes, and that this analysis be used as site selection and prioritization guidance by project proponents. We are also concerned that the amendment does not adequately protect against impacts from brine discharges. Our written comments discussed the need for receiving water limitations to be site-specific and highlighted the potential for the minimum recommendations made by the brine expert panel to not be met. These suggested changes were not incorporated into the final draft amendment or the change sheets, and we request that the amendment is edited to incorporate the brine expert panel's recommendations of no less than a 20-to-1 dilution. The panel also specified increases in natural background salinity of no more than 2 parts per thousand or 5%, whichever is lower, in order to avoid stratification. We are concerned that the addition of the option to use a reference site rather than site-specific data to establish background salinity will not meet the intent of the expert panel's recommendations. We'd also like to see the 5% maximum incorporated into the amendment. So given all these concerns, we recommend that if the State Water Board move forward with approval of the proposed amendment today, that it be modified to protect against impacts from brine discharges and clearly identify subsurface intakes as the best available technology.
Mr. Geaver, followed by David Armanasio for Deepwater Desal LLC.
My name is Joe Geaver, and I represent Surfrider Foundation, and thanks to the staff for all the hard work and for this hearing and the opportunity to comment. And we appreciate the staff's work and the policy and agree with the principles and intent. But we have a somewhat different request than my colleagues. We support the edits that my colleagues are offering, but we have to oppose the policy in this draft and ask for additional time to work with staff to make some clarifications to ensure that policy intent is actually realized. First, I want to assure the board that we're not asking for another bite at the apple. Like I said, we agree with the intent, and nobody wants the policy adopted more quickly than we do. We were requesting this desal policy in 2007 before the first draft of the OTC policy. And for this draft, we did our best to get you edits as soon as possible, even if that seemed like the 11th hour to you guys. It really was hard. Second, we think the new prohibition on increased intake and mortality for in-plant dilution mandates a postponement before you vote on the draft. We've requested that change before, way back when Dominic was the lead on OTC and desal, and he agreed with us that augmented intake was a flawed thing and was illegal. But the board is on record opposing our request to prohibit augmented intake. Fortunately, by law, you can reverse your position, but you can't do that without sound reasoning. You really should amend the staff report and SED and clarify your reasoning before taking the vote. We support the change, and we think it just takes a postponement. And we're willing to wait and see the rationale for exempting the Carlsbad facility. We understand that that site is not the best site for the best technology for intake and discharge. But that's the reason we want to offer some simple clarification language to meet the intent of the policy. We hope everyone now agrees that granting the temporary permit for Carlsbad enshrined the site and made best technology unnecessarily difficult. We don't think the Carlsbad facility complies with the intent of the policy, but we're much more concerned that the intent is not clear to future project proponents and won't be perfectly clear to the regional boards or the courts if it comes to that. And it's not just us that reads the draft that way. Project proponents with designs to utilize abandoned surface water intakes seem to see it the same way. There's a reason why they thanked you for taking a site-specific approach in the policy. And there's a reason why Poseidon executives are telling the Orange County Water District they see a clear path to getting surface intakes approved. Those buzzwords mean the same thing. The policy is not clear enough to ensure compliance with the intent. Look, I've been through this process several times. I helped write the comments, went to the permits, all that stuff. And I worked on the CalAM process to ensure that project was consistent with the intent of the law. I really appreciate Mayor Burnett coming here and commenting on how the process works. That's important. So look, I think I may have a unique perspective on the draft policy that others may not see, and I see the same clear path to surface intakes the project proponents see. I don't think that's the intent of the policy, nor your intent. Look, you're allowing Carlsbad to kill 3 times the amount of fish in the intake and 2 times the size of the dead zone in the discharge. The least you can do is let us help ensure that doesn't happen again. We may have to get used to the fact that Carlsbad is the horse that got away, but please give us a little time to work with you and your staff to ensure the Carlsbad mistake isn't repeated. If I can just offer a comment on the mitigation.
Great, and you should do it very quickly.
Okay, real quick. Look, I agree with Jonathan. You don't have to put that in the policy. You can reopen this policy anytime you want and reconsider the mitigation. I don't think you're going to find that fecundity hindcasting or adult equivalency loss is a better way to do it, but we're game for that. We'd like to fix the mitigation ratio. And on the feasibility thing, look, I think this argument that you're hearing is just one more example of their hope for a clear path to surface intakes. The changes just makes a small hurdle for them to jump. It's clear they want to get rid of that small hurdle just so they can get to surface intakes more easily. Anyway, I'm going to be around all day if you want to have more of that discussion. Thank you for the additional time.
Just a question. I appreciate your comments. I'm a bit confused though, because at least I didn't receive any suggested edits from you. I know that I received some from other parties. Was it something that you provided directly to staff? I'm curious. Your request for additional time was so that you could apparently provide some clarification on some of the aspects of the proposed amendment that concerns you. So I guess my question is, do you have specific changes you wanted to bring up, or have you provided that to the staff already?
Well, I did, and I will admit that this is a problem that I kind of caused, because I was waiting for my colleagues to get their recommended changes together and see if they were consistent, and what I realized was that I saw a more comprehensive change needed. I did quickly draft some really draft language that I sent to Jonathan, but I'm afraid that staff, because this process has moved so fast and these comments are kind of coming in late, staff was already working on the changes that my colleagues recommended. I think what they recommended is good. It makes it so that when we go to the regional boards, we at least have a fighting chance of getting these permits right. I think you can go a little bit farther and make the intent of this policy so clear that the regional board won't see these permits for bad projects. I think you can stop the application for bad projects now. It takes a little bit more clarification. I think it's all in there. So yeah, I gave Jonathan a list, and it was not well thought out, well grounded language, but to get all of the pieces of the puzzle put together will take a little bit of additional time. I'm not requesting, like I said, I want to retire. I started on this stuff in 2007. I want to be done with it as much as anybody, but not if we don't get there. I mean, look, I'm happy to hang around. I think we can do it relatively quickly. I think we're all on the same page. It's just not clear. That was a long response. I'm sorry, Tam.
Helpful. That was the question.
Okay, thanks, you guys.
To clarify, yes, Joe did send me some comments, and to be blunt, we had been looking at the totality, and I did a quick review of his comments, and I saw that there were some specific changes, but they seemed to fall into the same category as the comments that we were already making changes on, and so I didn't recommend that we move forward with those because they seem to be subsumed in what we were talking about. They were different approaches to it, but the point I think that he was trying to make was to make it clear that subsurface intakes are the preferred approach. And we try to do that, and I think that as we move forward later today, and we're talking about this, we will try and reiterate why we think that's the case. But I believe the language already in there, it doesn't say rebuttable presumption as the two words, but it does say subsurface intakes unless they're shown to be infeasible, and I believe that is an equivalent
And you've tightened
standard.
up the feasibility language.
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll think about it. I mean, we'll wait and see when we get to that point what my colleagues think, but we may want you to think about options, but it may also be fine. So we'll focus on that.
And I
later.
expect we'll hear a different opinion from the next speaker.
That's potentially correct. Mr. Armanosco, followed by Susan Jordan from the California Coastal Protection Network.
Madam Chair and board members, professional staff, thank you very much for this opportunity to address you today. I am representing Deepwater Desal. I am a native, born and raised on the Monterey Peninsula, continue to live there, raise my children there, and believe me, being a citizen of the Monterey Bay, we really understand conservation. We've been through droughts before, and I think that we have learned and have practiced every method of conservation in our region. The Monterey Bay region is severely stressed. You all know that. I don't have to go into detail about that. The Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary has in its policy that they favor a regional desalination facility. And so we've been working very closely with them and the California State Lands Commission as we've moved forward. And from other colleagues of mine who are here today, you'll hear a great deal more about that. But what I would like to do is the Castroville Community Services District wanted to submit a letter, and they asked me if I would submit it on their behalf. There's a couple of points in here that I would like to read to you. I won't read the whole letter, but I will give it to the clerk if that's permissible. This is addressed to you and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary and the California Coastal Commission. The Castroville Community Services District entered into a memorandum of intent to become a member of a joint powers authority to be formed in the future to consider purchasing 1,000 acre-feet of potable water from Deepwater Desal's Monterey Bay Regional Water Supply Project. Now, what's important about this is that the Desal project will become owned by the public. Deepwater is an entrepreneurial group that we are moving forward, have invested in a terrific amount of science, which you'll hear about. But our plan is that the Desal plant will become owned by the public, by stakeholders from around the Monterey Bay region that will be participant through a joint powers authority. In this letter, there is also a paragraph that says this district needs to replace 1,000 acre-feet of water now being pumped on an annual basis from the Salinas Valley groundwater basin in order to maintain a reliable source of potable water for the customers in our service area. The only long-term potential source of replacement water is the desalinated water from Monterey Bay. The district has identified the Deepwater Desalination Project, which is capable of providing 1,000 acre-feet of desalinated water to the district on an annual basis as the solution to the seawater intrusion problem that the Castroville Community Services District, as other regions in the Salinas Valley and along the coast in Santa Cruz and Monterey County are suffering. So we thank you very much for your consideration today, and we also thank you for all the work that's been going into the ocean plan. And as I say, colleagues here today will have more to offer on this project and why the Deep Canyon, the submarine canyon just off the Moss Landing shore, presents a unique opportunity. It's something that I learned through my 3 years on the Coastal Commission as a commissioner in going up and down the coast of California, knowing that there are some places that are suited and others that are not for the consideration of desalinization. Thank you very much.
Thank you
And
very
Madam
much.
Chair, just for clarity on the record, obviously the written comment period is closed on this. It sounds like most of the letter was read into the record. If you'd like, you can indulge him and provide him the opportunity to read the rest of the letter, but we would not be accepting written comments at this point in time based on the notices that have been provided.
All right. You got the gist. We got the gist. It's not very long. Thank you. All right. And I know we have quite a few speakers on Deepwater coming up. Ms. Jordan, followed by John Durdek from the Stanford Law School Environmental Law Clinic.
Susan Jordan, I'm the director of the California Coastal Protection Network, and I come at this policy with my statewide policy hat on, but I'm also informed by my experience on the ground dealing with actual projects and applicants as they make their way through the permitting process. On the one hand, we have an applicant like CalAm who made a commitment to pursue a site that could accommodate subsurface intakes to minimize marine life mortality. On the other hand, we have an applicant like Poseidon, who is a private, for-profit merchant water supplier unregulated by the CPUC, who, despite knowing that this policy was years in the making, stubbornly refused to deviate from its decades-old business plan to co-locate with and utilize open ocean intakes, and who argued as recently as November 2013 in front of the California Coastal Commission that subsurface intakes were infeasible, without even producing studies to remotely justify that assertion. And in fact, an expert panel convened after that is still in process found that subsurface intakes at that site were indeed technically feasible. The key point here is that CalAm's decision to do subsurface was voluntary, and that is why it's critical that this policy, which will guide the introduction of desalination statewide, make it abundantly clear that the use of subsurface intakes is not a preference, it's not preferred, it's a rebuttable presumption. I believe that is the board's intent, but without further clarification, we do not believe the policy achieves that goal. Our coastal waters are a public trust resource that must be protected and can only be exploited if the public's need for that resource outweighs the attendant harm. And in this case, I should point out that harm is going to be ongoing in perpetuity. We know that subsurface intakes are less damaging than open ocean intakes, and as such must be the first choice. We appreciate that the language regarding public trust resources was placed in the resolution. We asked for it to be in the policy because In the resolution, it doesn't carry the force of law. Nobody's going to be reading that. Nobody's going to be citing to that section. We need it to be a rulemaking statement. Having been through the process on the ground, I can tell you that there will be applicants who will do everything within their power to prove that subsurface intakes are infeasible. And that's what this policy must anticipate, it must guard against, and indeed prevent where possible. I guess what I want to close on is in listening to the testimony from Poseidon, referencing their letter that talks about capital infrastructure expenditures at Carlsbad, listening to the San Diego County Water Authority talk about Pendleton, that's a 150 MGD facility. We know where they're going with this. And even though they stopped in, I believe, in mid-process of a subsurface feasibility study, I think you need to anticipate that they don't move forward with open ocean intakes on other major commercial entities moving forward. The policy doesn't do that right now, and this is your only chance to get it right. So I'm really urging you to please get it right. Makes it easier for me as a foot soldier on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dudek. And next, followed by Jared Ficker from Cal Strat.
Morning, Chair Marcus, honored board members. I'm John Durdek, a certified law student from Stanford Law School's Environmental Law Clinic.
What does being a certified law student mean? I would think about certified used cars, but I don't think that's the same thing.
It's probably on the same level.
That means you can appear as a lawyer?
The process goes through the bar. The bar approves you as a certified law student with a supervising attorney.
I don't know that they had that in my day. Or maybe I just wasn't qualified to be certified. I don't know. It's just interesting.
I'm very proud for the ability to be here. I'm also speaking on behalf of the California Coastal Protection Network. We're pleased that the State Water Board is considering statewide policy to guide potential development of desalination facilities. We thank the board and staff for all their hard work. At the same time, it's important to remember that the state's coastal water and marine life are public trust resources. The board, the regional water boards, and the many local agencies who will be involved in decisions about desalination have an affirmative duty to protect these resources. Today, in exercising its trust responsibilities, the State Water Board can help ensure that desalination projects further public purposes and create no substantial effect on public trust resources. Here, the board can do three things. First, should clearly state that the public trust doctrine is a foundational consideration for the rest of the policy. Second, it should require a clear and well-supported demonstration of a community's need for desalinated water at an early point in the consideration of any proposed desalination facility. And third, it should explicitly state a rebuttable presumption in favor of the use of subsurface intakes, which are indisputably the best available design and technology measure to minimize intake and mortality of marine life. Some specific recommendations. To remedy the first issue, we recommend that the Water Board restate the Water Board's public trust doctrine responsibilities expressly in the amendment itself, rather than note them in the adopting resolution. The board should also clarify that the doctrine is not something to apply only when feasible, as suggested in paragraph 7 of the resolution, but rather it is an affirmative duty that must inform all decisions made under the amendment. Second, we recommend requiring applicants and the regional water boards to cite language regarding the need for desalinated water in an existing urban water management plan or in the absence of such a plan to address the criteria of such plans as provided by Water Code Section 10631. This is not a perfect solution, but is preferable to alternatives such as water purchase agreements, which are negotiated in isolation, or county general plans, which likely will not provide the requisite specificity to satisfy a regional board's public trust duty. Third and finally, the board should revise the amendment's language to state that the use of subsurface intakes shall be presumed to be the best design and technology measure feasible to minimize intake and mortality of marine life. This change would properly and unambiguously place the burden of proof on the applicant rather than the state or the people and fulfill the agency's public trust duty. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Ficker, followed by Joe Phelan from Tenera Environmental and Deepwater Desal. This is also Deepwater Desal.
Chair Marcus and members of the board, my name is Jared Ficker with California Strategies. I'm involved with a consulting firm that has worked extensively on water resources and coastal development issues. Most recently, we participated in the development of the Deepwater Desal project that has taken a unique approach to leveraging science-based locationing to minimizing impacts. First, I want to thank you and your staff for leadership during this unprecedented drought and time where we need to be seriously considering adapting to the effects of global climate change. Today, I have a few brief comments, and some of my colleagues will have some additional comments who have been involved in the science-based approach to locationing. Today, we're not really here to talk about projects, but rather the policy. So my comments are this on the policy. In our estimation, the policy is a little too rigid in its subsurface requirement. As drafted, the policy is not just a technology preference, but rather a technology requirement. The feasibility analysis on subsurface is appropriate, but we are concerned that the stated policy is a technology requirement, not a policy of direction on policy analysis to evaluate the least impactful projects.
Wait, so you read it completely the opposite of some of our earlier speakers, presumably, who think it's an open invitation for open ocean intakes?
No, we don't read it that way because we believe absolutely that as it's not a technology preference, it's a technology requirement. And as we go through the process, the board's explicit language requiring this, we believe will be misconstrued as we go through the process. So clarity on the feasibility analysis and all the different agencies, it was mentioned previously, de novo review. So for example, if we go through the state lands process something, go through the feasibility analysis standards, which I think are robust policy, and we're going to include that in our alternatives analysis as we look at a project. But what I'm concerned about, and the comments have been made here before about a rebuttable presumption, a requirement is different than a preference. It's very rare in policy making and direction by state agencies or federal agencies for that matter, that there is a requirement on a technology.
Do you think that a rebuttable presumption is a requirement?
The policy says requirement. Rebuttable presumption is, I think, a description. I think the policy says requirement, and that's what I'm reacting to.
Yeah, that's right. There's the words is from section D1A says the regional board in consultation with state water board staff shall require subsurface intake.
Unless infeasible.
Unless.
Yeah, and our focus is, and we agree with the notion of analyzing a technology preference. And so anyway, I will conclude my remarks. The science to justify subsurface intake requirement is, in our estimation, incomplete, and some additional work on better understanding significant greenhouse gas emissions, impacts to benthic and marine microorganisms, and impacts to the coastal zone, particularly if, as construed today, subsurface means also infiltration galleries. In particular, I want to return to this notion of greenhouse gas emissions. It was commented by the staff that this should be dealt with in CEQA. In our estimation, particularly with the governor's newest recommendations on reducing greenhouse gases, if there are significant impacts associated with subsurface intakes, this should be considered in the technology requirement that the state board is recommending in the proposed policy. Finally, we believe the policy needs a little more emphasis on intelligent siting. Existing intakes with energy generation facilities or shallow water intakes, in our estimation, are certainly not optimal, but that's not all that exists out in the world. We think a science-based approach to siting, taking advantage of offshore oceanographic considerations, should be really a paramount consideration. In addition, it's also important to consider that many locations in the statements were made today, particularly around Monterey, this is replacement for impaired surface and groundwater. So not in all cases is this facilitating new growth, but actually dealing with very impaired water sources. To conclude, drought conditions and climate change are important reminders of the need for policy flexibility. We're supportive of the policy as proposed today with minor amendments to clarify subsurface intakes are a policy preference, must be analyzed, but not required. And finally, I would like to echo the notion and concern about an MOU be put together. It would be nice to see this concurrent with the adoption of the policy, but that will provide, I think, a lot of clarity as anybody navigates the permitting process, and we would strongly align our comments with, I think, just about everyone who agrees with that would be a constructive thing. Thanks for your consideration and really your leadership on these water resource issues. Sure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Phelan, followed by John Steinbeck from Tenero.